Welcome to tonight's webinar, which we will be discussing top tips for tupping. So if you just move on to the next slide, please, Ailey. So I'm Laura Henderson and I'm an agriculture consultant with SEC and I'll be chairing tonight's webinar. Our guest speaker for tonight is Ailey Corr from SRUC Veterinary Services, and she's based in Inverness. And we also have Ian Boyd from SEC Consultant Solutions available to help with any technical issues that you may encounter. So you can just pop those into the questions or the wee chat box. So tonight, Ailey will be covering in the next hour about buying in livestock, what questions you should ask of the seller, about quarantine treatments, and we'll also be covering tup and yow emoties and all the T's. So there'll be about 15 minutes at the end for questions, but as I said, do just ask questions throughout, although we'll just keep them until the end. So I think that's time to hand over to Ailey now.
Hello, right. Thank you very much, Laura, and thank you anyone who's joined us tonight. We were wondering whether anybody would show up, given we had a bit of competition in the form of Mr. Johnson making a statement tonight about the latest COVID regulations. So I'm very flattered if anybody's turned up to see me instead of Boris. So just a wee bit of introduction about who I am. Some of you may have joined some of these webinars in the past or some of the Farm Advisory Service meetings that we've held. So I've done a few of those now. My name is Ailey Corr. I'm a veterinary investigation officer with SRUC Vet Services, and as Laura says, I'm based in Inverness. We've got a network of surveillance hubs across Scotland, and those are generally where farmers and crofters would tend to come into contact with us. It tends to be when something's gone horribly wrong, unfortunately. So we are here to help with disease investigations. That can be routine things like sending in blood or dung samples for us to try and get to the bottom of any problems you might be having, right the way through to doing post-mortem investigations and farm visits if there's a bigger, more sort of significant disease problem on farm. And the overall purpose of this is to carry out veterinary surveillance. So our job is looking out for unusual disease patterns, new diseases. We're all very conscious of how new diseases can come from animals sometimes, as we've found this year. And we're really there to support your own vets in working with you to get to the bottom of these sort of things. And it's just worth underlining that we've got access to a really big network of species specialists as well. So if you contact one of us and we don't know the answer, we can usually find somebody who does. So worth thinking of us if you've got any sort of disease issues. Hopefully we can help. So we're going to cover a few things tonight, but at this time of year, lots and lots of people are buying in stock. So really, I'm just hoping to get you to have a little bit of a think about what's going on when you buy in stock. I'm going to encourage you to think about what you need to ask, what you need to do, and how long you need to do it for. So much of this may well be quite obvious to you, much of this may well be familiar to you, and if that's the case, give yourselves a pat on the back. It's always quite difficult when we've got a big range of experience, range of knowledge when people attend these things. So you may well find you pick up something new. Please do ask questions if there's anything that sails over your head, or ask questions if there's anything you feel I haven't covered. We'll try and address those as we go, although I'm quite sure if there's anything very pertinent, Laura might jump in and we can discuss it as we go. So first things first, when you're buying in stock, and here I'm not just talking about tups, yows as well, any stock really that you buy, what should you be asking? So there's a few questions you need to ask of the person you're buying the stock from, and sometimes of yourself as well. You need to think about the disease status of stock that you buy, the vaccination status, and have a think about what sort of environment they're coming into when they come back to your premises. What do you need to do when you buy in stock? Well, I'm going to say quarantine them. It's really important that you buy in stock and don't mix them immediately with your own flock, just in case you bring in more than you bargained for. And then the question next is, how long should we do that for? So hopefully Laura's got some polls set up, and now's probably a good time to put you on the spot.
So The highest response was 39% said that they quarantined for 2 weeks.
Okay.
Then joint second was 3 and 4 weeks at 22% each. And then we had 17% said they quarantined for 1 week. And thankfully, no one says no quarantine at all.
Oh well, full marks. Everybody's doing the right thing. Okay. So yeah, so many of you might well be aware that we encourage you to try and quarantine for 4 weeks if possible. But as long as you can, really, and I suspect, you know, I don't know if this would be your experience, Laura, but I certainly expect that for a lot of people, it's actually down to what's practical and what facilities they have and how long they can keep stock there. So I definitely recognise that it's not always easy to do things to the gold standard, but if you can aim for 4 weeks, that's what we'd recommend. And there's a few reasons for that, but mainly it's just to give time for you to take some of the steps that you need to take during the quarantine period to avoid introducing disease, and also just to allow anything that might be incubating in the animal to come to the forefront so that you can identify them as unwell before you turn them out. Just put this slide in because I like the idea of the sheep waiting for the official all clear. But really that's the idea with quarantining, is that you have a little bit of time before you get the all clear and wave them on into your flock. Okay, so the next slide's horrible. There's lots of text, but I'm just going to go through a few points on it because it's an important one. Vaccination status. So you can have a wee read through this, but I've already said vaccination status is something that you need to be talking to the person you buy the animal from to find out about whether they've had any vaccines. But it's an important thing to think about, because if there's any uncertainty at all over whether they've been vaccinated, I would really encourage you to, if in doubt, get them vaccinated again. Now, the quote that's on this slide is one from a letter that was published in the Vet Record a couple of years ago. And it's essentially what's possibly a bit of a back of the fag packet sort of calculation, but it definitely holds water. So they start off by pointing out that over 70% of rams are purchased for over £400, and we're all very well aware of that, and some of them cost an awful lot more than that as well. So really what they've done here is just had a little think about how much it costs to buy 2 doses of vaccine. So obviously, as you'll be aware, if you're buying your HepTvac P or even Ovivac P, the pack sizes allow you to buy 25 doses at a minimum. So it's really frustrating because you know you're going to be binning some of them. But if that animal lives as a result of being vaccinated, it takes the cost to 15 pence a lamb. However, if it dies after siring one crop, perhaps from pasteurlosis or blackleg or something, some sort of clostridial disease, you're talking over £7 a head per lamb. So it can make an inexpensive tup become very, very expensive. I think I definitely recognise the frustration that comes when you're having to bin doses of vaccine. There are potentially ways around it for some holdings. If you're buying a small number of animals and you have a neighbour or a friend who's buying a small number as well, there is the possibility to perhaps split a bottle. Please be careful though. Vaccines are quite fragile products. They don't say that it only lasts for 8 hours once opened on the label out of badness. It's because once you open that, they are, as I say, pretty fragile, and there's no guarantee that the product will be effective once it's been open for a long period of time. It's really important you store vaccines properly and carefully, keep them in the fridge, follow the datasheet guidance, and as I say, if you can possibly find a way around it to make sure that they're fully covered if they haven't been fully vaccinated or if their vaccination status is unknown, then I would really urge you to get in there and get that done. Be a little bit mindful of vaccinations because they can sometimes cause a little bit of a rise in the temperature of an animal as their immune system responds to the vaccine. So just be a little bit mindful of that. That's one to discuss with your vet if you're vaccinating them quite close to when you want the tups to go to work. Do have a wee chat with your vet about that one, but otherwise, no, definitely worth considering. So the next thing to think about is disease status. So, and there's 2 aspects to this, because you need to know or you might need to know the disease status of the holding the animal came from, but you also kind of need to know your own to be able to make good judgments. So there's no point paying a fortune for an animal that's free of disease X, Y, or Z if actually you've got uncontrolled disease X within your flock. So you kind of need to know your own status before you can really make good judgments on the animals that are coming in. So just a few diseases to think about. There are lots, as you'll be aware. Top left here, you've got this miserable looking sole. This would be a suspect for mydivisna. I think I can guess what the X on the bum means. So this is a viral disease that can cause wasting, and it's probably quite a big cause of losses within flocks where it's established. So that's something you might want to think about. Definitely, if you know that you're free of that condition, or if you're trying to control it, obviously you need to make sure you don't buy more of the problem in. Next one along, I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but the sheep here with the lumpy face, this is a classic kind of presentation of CLA, caseous lymphadenitis. Unpleasant bacterial disease causes sort of horrible putty lumps around about the head and neck usually, and the face, and it's very infectious, and you certainly don't want to be buying that in. So that's something else you might want to be looking for. Bottom left, I don't know, it's not a brilliant picture. This is just one I've nicked from the internet, I'm afraid, but this is a lamb or a sheep that has OPA, or it would definitely be suspicious for it. So OPA is ovine pulmonary adenocarcinoma. That's also known as Yagzikti. It's a cancer really of the lungs, but it's caused by a viral infection. And again, it can be really quite a big cause of losses in affected flocks. And it would tend to come in when you've bought in stock. So that's another one to think about. You see this lamb here has got fluid running from its nose, and that's just what's produced when this tumour is established in the lungs. And I just put this grim picture of an aborted lamb in just to remind you that that would often be how people would introduce enzootic abortion when they're buying in stock. So that's something to think about. And again, ask the question: have they been vaccinated? You know, just make sure you're well informed. And sometimes a chat with your vet before you even go shopping is a good idea, just to help you know what to look for, what's important and what's not. Just this lovely picture of a sheep being blood sampled. I don't know about you, but I have never ever seen this scenario when blood sampling a sheep in all my days. Wouldn't it be nice? However, it's just to remind me to say to you that a benefit of the quarantine period is you've got a chance to get in there and you know, you can do some screening. If you bought in animals and their status isn't known, this is your chance to find out, the last chance really, before you introduce them to your flock. So it's a good opportunity to get the vet to come and do some testing if you think that's going to be a valuable thing to do. And just a wee plug for the sheep and goat health schemes. I'm not directly involved with them at all through work, but obviously the health scheme can be really useful if you have a disease problem that you are trying to control or eliminate from your flock, or indeed if you are free from a disease, then the health schemes are a good way of finding safe stock to replace yours with. Okay, so moving on from disease status, let's have a think about parasite status. What else are you buying in? Any friends, or are they coming in with the stock that you buy? So this animal on the left, this is a sheep scab case. You'd never have guessed it. And clearly nobody's going to go and buy this animal. But really the important thing to emphasize here is that sheep scab cases do not all look like this, and it would be not uncommon for perfectly normal looking animals with intact fleeces. They look okay, nothing major. They could still bring in sheep scab. It's not unusual for them to perhaps be carrying a very low burden of mites and not have a big issue, and that doesn't mean to say the mites aren't there. They're microscopic, you can't see them. So be very, very mindful of the fact that buying in animals is a big risk point for introducing scab. And obviously, what could they be carrying internally in terms of worms, in terms of liver fluke? You need to have a think about that, not just in terms of the worms causing a problem for those animals themselves, but also could the worms or fluke be resistant to treatments that you might want to use? And if those resistant parasites become established on your holding, then is that leaving you with a problem that you can't control in the future? So just be very careful that you don't end up buying in more problems than you could have anticipated. So we'll have a little bit more of a chat about that in some more detail just now. So quarantine treatments. Quarantine is also an opportunity for you to get in there and treat animals to make sure they don't bring anything into your flock when they join them. There's two main kind of categories of things you might treat for: internal parasites, so the gutworms and fluke we've spoken about, and the external ones, so primarily scab, but obviously you don't want them wandering in with lice either. So there's three main reasons why we think about quarantine treatment. Primarily, we don't want animals to have parasites because it affects their health. So we're thinking about, particularly you've got a tup, you want that tup to be in good form and go out to work. You don't want it to be carrying around a burden of parasites. So treating them is important to make sure they're ready to go. We also don't want to introduce disease, so scab is a risk. We don't want to introduce that to our flock. So this treatment during the quarantine period is an opportunity for us to make sure that that doesn't happen. And importantly, to avoid introducing resistant parasites. So treating them very strategically during quarantine to make sure that we've done everything we can to wipe out parasites that might be hard to control otherwise is important. But it is a bit of a minefield. So the dream and the reality. I don't know if any of you are Father Ted fans, but I love this scene in particular. The easy way that Dougal mixes up dreams and reality, and I think sometimes when we're thinking about quarantine treatments, it's pretty easy to do that. I mean, obviously, the picture on the top left is what we would all like, and perhaps some of you who've tuned in are able to look out your window and see that in the morning. But I suspect for many people, the picture in the top right is closer to the reality. And a lot of Scotland, particularly where sheep are concerned, we're dealing with this sort of ground, which is a not such great ground and a real habitat for liver fluke in particular. So quarantine treatments. I don't know if any of you will have seen this chart before, but this chart can be found on the SCOPS website. SCOPS is Sustainable Control of Parasites in Sheep, and if you haven't had a look on that website before, I would completely encourage you to go and have a wee nosy in there. It's a really useful site. It's got lots and lots of information on there. Much of it's really nicely presented and well communicated, very easy to understand, and if you're a details person, you can download the SCOPS manual, which gives you very in-depth guidance on control of parasites, their life cycles, problems with treatment. Really great resource. However, I think if you're in the shoes of someone who's bought in some stock and time's of the essence and they want to get in there and just get them treated and do the right thing, it can be a little bit overwhelming to decide what you need to do. I think the chart here, really the idea behind it is that you can decide whether you want to apply a gold standard treatment or are slightly less concerned about going for the gold standard, and it guides you through which treatments you should give. But it can be quite overwhelming, particularly if you're looking at quite a small number of animals. Perhaps you've bought 3 or 4 tups, or just a handful, and often some of the package quantities for these products can be quite big. The practicalities can be difficult. So it's really just to get across to you that I do appreciate that it's easy for us to say this is what you should be doing, but the realities of it on the ground are difficult. And I think that the important thing is that we recognise that this is really important, and we try to find ways around it so we can do the absolute best that we can. And for that, you're probably going to need to consult with your vet. So just to try and simplify it a little bit, a few things to think about. Now, firstly, if any of you have ever done anything as exciting as a risk assessment, this will be familiar to you, but we need to sort of think about our attitude to risk and measure the risk realistically. So first things first, how likely is the risk to occur? So what we're worried about here is bringing in parasites in a new animal that are not going to be controlled by the treatments we would usually use, and therefore giving us a much bigger parasite problem than we would normally have expected to be dealing with. So the likelihood of that happening, well, we know resistance is out there, we diagnose it occasionally. Is it on every second farm? To an extent, but the real big baddies, like resistance to triclobendazole in liver fluke, that's, it's definitely out there, but probably still infrequently confirmed. So the likelihood of the risk is moderate. It might happen, but it's by no means guaranteed. The size of the risk, however, that's a little bit different. So thinking about the impact that this could have if it did come into your farm. So for example, if you've got a farm with lots of boggy pasture, lots of fluke habitat where the snails that carry the fluke can live, then if you find yourself with a resistant strain of liver fluke living on that pasture that you can't control using normal methods, that could have a huge impact on the productivity of your flock. So it's important to have a think about these things and probably have a chat with your vet about them as well, because they're going to know your flock, they're going to know your holding, your pasture, sort of ground you have available to you, and they can help you make some decisions about, what does the risk look like to me? Is it something I really need to be bothered about? The answer is probably yes, but how much do you need to be bothered about it? How much action do you need to take is what we really want to boil this down to. Is there a scab risk? I kind of laugh if we just go back a slide. You've got the scab risk with dipping, scab risk without dipping, or if you don't have a scab risk at all. I would really question whether you can buy in stock and decide that you don't have a risk of scab. I think it's a microscopic mite. You can't see it, and I think you cannot therefore say that there's no risk or low risk of scab. I think you have to be sceptical about that one. Again, as I mentioned before, do you have a fluky sort of habitat on the farm? Have you got bogs? Have you got rashes? Have you got lots of muddy gateways, puddles? All of these places will allow the wee snail, Galba truncatula, which is an essential part of the liver fluke's life cycle, to live. If you don't have any fluky habitat on the farm, you don't really need to worry about it, because no fluke is going to be able to persist on your farm. The eggs will come out in the dung, but there won't be any snails for them to move into, so they won't persist. Again, dreams, reality, most people will have fluky habitat on their farm, and I think that's a really important thing to consider. And particularly with regards to fluke treatment, you probably need to get a plan pinned down with your vet in terms of what exactly you need to do to prevent any contamination of your pasture with potentially resistant fluke. That's a real biggie. It's a tricky one, but it is achievable. And finally, what sort of quarantine facilities do you have available? I mean, in an ideal world, you'll have a yard that you put them on for a couple of days while you get them wormed, and they can shed any eggs that they're carrying onto that yard, and then you'll put them onto a sort of dryish, contaminated paddock that's dirty from your own sheep grazing it for a few weeks to complete their quarantine before they join the rest of the flock. Again, that's an ideal world. Many people may not have the option to do that, but that doesn't mean you can't do something nearly as good. So again, discuss this with your vet. It's a really useful thing to build into health planning. If you're sitting down with your vet anyway once a year, much better than a panicked phone call the day before you go and buy in some stock. Have it planned out. This is where I can put them, and I'll put them for this period of time, and these are the treatments I'll give. So try and get that laid out in advance. The pictures on the right here, the bottom right here just shows you this is what a liver looks like when you've got a really horrible, good going liver fluke infestation. You can actually almost see a little brown leaf-like liver fluke stuck on the surface. You know what a liver should look like. You really don't want to be having these things living in your liver. Okay, so just trying to simplify quarantine a little bit. Again, you need to discuss precise product use with your vet, but using a combination of one of the macrocyclic lactones, so your mectins, your doromectins, moxidectins, ivermectins, using one of these and then following it up with one of the new wormer classes, monopantal or derquantal, is a really thorough way of making sure that there's no resistant worms coming into your holding. Again, sometimes problems with product sizes if you can only get a big pack, but it's really worth discussing with your vet whether there's room for them to split packs, for example, whether you can share with someone, or whether they'll dispense smaller doses. They may not be able to do that, but it's worth asking the question. In terms of scab, obviously lots and lots of people love the convenience of the injectable drugs that we have now if you can get hold of them. Dectomax, Cydectin tend to be used very, very widely. couple of potential problems with those. One is that when you use these for treating scab, you're also treating worms, which is a good thing if that's what you want to do, but if it's not what you want to do, you may be increasing the risk of resistance. In the quarantine context, it's probably acceptable, but we should say that it's been confirmed down in Wales, albeit, that there are some scab mites around that are now resistant to those treatments. So the only way of controlling those particular mites is going to be dipping. So again, if you've got the chance and the option to dip animals that are coming in, that's the gold standard. Not always practical, but definitely worth considering. And for fluke, again, as I said, you need to discuss this with your vet. It needs multiple treatments and careful quarantining. Now, there's a couple of reasons for this. One of them is that liver fluke lay eggs when they're adult liver fluke. So once they're sort of 12 weeks of age and older, so they've been in the animal for 12 weeks, they start laying eggs, and the eggs are shed into the gallbladder, and they'll sit in the gallbladder and make their way out into the intestine and into the dung over time. Now, you can kill all of the adult fluke in an animal, but the eggs may take a bit longer to come out simply because there's a reservoir of them in the gallbladder. So we expect animals to shed eggs for probably up to about 3 weeks after the adult liver fluke have all been killed. So it's worth bearing that in mind. You may have given a fluke treatment, but it doesn't mean that there couldn't be eggs from those flukes still going onto your pasture. And if those fluke happen to be resistant ones and those eggs go onto wet, boggy pasture where there might be snails, you could be setting yourself up for a problem. The other point that you really need to think about here is that if you give a product that kills liver fluke from 6 weeks of age and up, then that's great. You'll have killed those adult liver fluke, and after your 3-week period, the eggs won't be shed anymore. But if that product is left to all of the fluke that are 6 weeks and younger still in the sheep, then 6 weeks later, those will be starting to reach maturity and shedding eggs of their own. So you may still have a fluke burden on board. And that's the reason that fluke quarantine treatments are particularly important to discuss with your vet, so that you choose a combination of treatments and timing that maximises the chances of getting rid of fluke eggs before they go out and contaminate your pasture. It's obviously harder if your pasture mostly contains habitat where the fluke snails could survive, but it's just all the more important that you have this planned out with your vet in advance. So I would really encourage you to have that conversation with them. Okay, so we're going to move on. Now we've done quarantine to death and you're probably all bored witless of wormers and fluke treatments. Let's have a think about tup and emoties. So first of all, tup emoties, why do we do it? Why is it important? Simple equation, if they're healthy, they're going to be more productive, and they have to be comfortable, they have to feel well for successful mating. You want these boys to go out, to be in the mood to do the job. They've got to be comfortable, they've got to be free from pain, and you need to do this early enough that they have time to heal and get better if you identify a problem. So nutrition and body condition, again, is really important. If they're over fat, they're going to be slow, they're going to be lazy, you won't get the best out of them, but they will lose quite a lot of body condition during the whole mating period. So sometimes sort of 15% of their body weight. That's really pretty dramatic. So you need to give them enough reserves that they're able to do the job as well. So aim for sort of 3.5 body condition score, kind of happy medium. That'll allow for some losses, and hopefully they won't be so slow that they don't get the job done. Okay, so another poll to wake everyone up, Laura.
100% of everyone has said that it should be
Full
all of the
marks.
above. Yes.
And they're awake. Lovely.
Yes. Everyone's paying attention.
Good stuff. Good stuff. So that's exactly right. There are probably a few other things we should look at, but those are the biggies. So we'll just take you through this. Again, many of you will be familiar with this, but it is important and it's worth going over. Teeth are obviously important. Now, yes, we talk about doing this in time that you can rectify problems. Nobody's talking about giving tups dental implants, but it is a worthwhile thing to check their teeth routinely with tups, because it will have an impact on their ability to maintain nutrition. So check their teeth. Broken mouth is going to be a problem. While you're looking at the head, have a good examine for any of the sort of nasty CLA type lumps we were talking about. Check for any sort of eye issues, pink eye, anything like that. So just a general check over. Have a listen to them. Are they wheezy? Quite often find with tups, particularly Texels, you can hear them rasping and wheezing away, doing a sort of Darth Vader impression. That's not normal. It can be problematic. It's something you want to talk to your vet about. Moving on, again, check what trim they're in, body condition, we've spoken about that already. You're wanting to be doing this well in advance, and we'll quiz you in a minute as to how long you should be thinking about this, but you want to do this well in advance of putting them to work so that you've got time to identify and rectify any problems you might pick up while you do this exam. Tackle, so you want to examine the penis and the testes carefully. So with the penis, have a look at the prepuce, which is the foreskin that you can see marked C on this picture. You'll find that you want to have a wee look there and just gently extrude the penis itself from within to have a look. There's a picture in a slide or two's time where we'll look at that in more detail, but you're looking for any sort of lesions, any ulcers, obvious injuries that might put him off doing the job. Looking at the testes, it's important you examine the testes, use both hands if at all possible, because you're checking for symmetry. So you want these testes to be equal on both sides. Have a good feel for any lumps, bumps, nodules, particularly looking for any pain responses. They shouldn't be particularly painful, they should be smooth and equal. If one is obviously much smaller or bigger than the other, you need to talk to your vet. You will expect normally to feel the epididymis, and again I'll show you that in a diagram, but the epididymis itself is a sort of part of the sperm making machinery, but you can feel that on both testes running down the back of them, so don't worry if you do feel that. But again, check thoroughly, make sure everything's equal and smooth and comfortable. And finally, have a look at their feet. That's really important and probably overlooked. We've all seen, as you go about the countryside, you see these miserable looking tups crippling away in the field or grazing on their knees, hugely common. And I think they just get forgotten a lot of the year, and then all of a sudden, you know, tupping's upon us and we need to get them on their feet again. So it's really important we look after their feet, look out for any signs of scald, foot rot. Don't go mad with pairing. We used to think pairing was the solution to all hoof trouble. It isn't. We probably over pair feet and cause more problems. But have a good look at their feet, identify any problems you've got, and obviously if you're not getting a handle on it, have a chat with your vet about it. Other than that, just take the opportunity to give them a good once over. Look for any wounds, any lesions, check for any evidence of sort of skittery bums. Might be a good time to do some dung sampling to check whether there could be worm burdens that need to be controlled. Just give them a general MOT. You want them to be in absolute best of health. So we're going to fire in with another poll now, just in case anybody's wavering a bit. How long do sperm take to mature in the tup?
So 56% of attendees have said it's 8 weeks, 22% said 12 weeks, 4 weeks was the option for 11% of attendees, and then 1 week and 16 weeks both got 6%.
Okay, so that's fair enough. So usually we're probably looking around 6 to 8 weeks. Now, as I say, it's not an exact science, but the important message here is that the sperm that you need to be ready to go when the tup is out with the ewes is being made weeks and weeks beforehand. Okay, so this is the real reason that tup MOTs are so important, that you don't leave them to the last minute. Because if you find a problem that's having an impact on fertility, and it doesn't have to be a problem with the testes, a systemic infection where they've got a bit of a fever will be enough to knock back sperm production. That will have a hangover effect that lasts weeks. Okay, so you want them to be in really good health, ideally 6-8 weeks before tupping, in order that they're in good enough shape and the sperm are good enough quality and good enough number to do the job. So that's why we bang on about doing it so early. It's not to say that you can't fix things. You can't get in there if you aren't in time, but we would really encourage you to plan well in advance for this. So just a few further points. So just looking at, just going back over the anatomy really. So top left here, I thought we had a picture in our archive of a penis. Particularly a sheep's penis, not one in general. But unfortunately, I couldn't find it, so I had to run the gauntlet of switching off Safe Search, and it wasn't pleasant, but I did it for you. So here we go, we've got a ram's penis here, and the reason I've included it is if you haven't looked at one before, many of you may well have done, you will probably run for the hills when you see it. It's got this long process, this sort of wiggly process at the front, okay? That is perfectly normal, there's nothing wrong with them. But you need to check that to make sure it's still intact. So sometimes that might have been lost through disease or injury. You want to have a look at the penis for any sort of ulcers, any sort of lesions or obvious damage to it. This bit has to work for the whole process to work. Again, just having a good look at the testes, make sure they're symmetrical, as we've said. You will feel sort of down the side of, obviously they're oval in shape, so the length of one of each side of each testis, you'll feel this sort of lump of epididymis, and it comes to a sort of head almost at one end of the testis, and that's normal, and you should be able to feel that on both sides. So essentially anything asymmetrical, that's a problem and you need to talk to your vet. And again, just to remind you, have a proper look at their feet, turn them over, examine closely. They need their feet to work, to be comfortable, to be able to do the job. So the next slide, we've got a wee video here. Now, unfortunately, we can't get the sound to play, but this is a video.
We can, Ailey, we can, hopefully.
Can you? Or are you able to get it fired up, Laura? That would be brilliant. Good wee video.
Give me a second till I get this set up.
For a ram MOT, we want to do a visual assessment of the ram standing on its feet. We've seen the ram walking round about, and he's walking smoothly and soundly on his legs. The ram is looking alert and bright. He's nice, alert, bright eyes, nice wet muzzle. We want to have a look at his teeth and make sure he's got all his teeth. He has, and his teeth are meeting his pad correctly and smoothly. So this tup is his mouth's fit to go and graze and chase ewes for another season. He's in good condition. Ideally, you want your ram in a condition score of 3.5 to 4 at this time of year, and this ram's as a 3.5. He's looking well and in good order. As I said, he's paraded round the pen here soundly on his legs. We're now going to tip him up on his back and have a thorough look at his feet. So we've got the ram immobilised. We're going to have a thorough look at his feet and in between his toes to make sure there's no granulomas or lumps or sores in between his toes, and his feet are absolutely perfect. The next thing we want to look at is his testicles, and we want to have a good examination of the testicles. Firstly, you should have two. They should be evenly sized and they should be able to move freely within his scrotum, as this ram's do. They should be fun to the touch, they shouldn't be spongy, and they should be about the same consistency of a flexed bicep. At the base of his testicles, he should have two firm ping pong ball sized objects, and this is his epididymis. This is where the sperm is stored, and this tup is perfect in that department. His testicles should be about the same circumference as my thumb and fingers make, as a rough guide, probably about 35 to 40 centimetres. The bigger the testicles, the better. Smaller rams are perfectly fertile and able to mate, use and breed. However, they don't have the same semen storage and capacity to go in and tup the same amount of sheep. The final place we want to look when we're examining a ram is at his penis, and his penis should be able to be extracted quite easily from his sheath, and in examination it should be free from any lumps or sores. It shouldn't be red or sore or have anything there that's going to restrict him from mating with the ewe, and the worm at the end of his penis should be free from lumps that may suggest that this ram has got urinary calculi, but this ram is absolutely perfect in that respect. Now, a good fit, sound ram like this should be perfectly able to go and mate with 80 ewes. Now, a tup MOT is very important, as I said, and it's very important you do this at least 6 to 8 weeks pre-tupping.
Great.
So that should be back to you, Ailey, but if anyone didn't have any sound there, I think someone did say that they'd struggle with sound, I will send you the link to that video so you can watch it in your own time.
Super duper. Grand. Right, is that back to me? You see my video still screen now?
Should be now,
Here we
Ailey.
go. Yep. There we go. Okay. Good. Right, let's not skip forward too far. Okie doke, so a few things just to think about with tups. Common problems that we would see more in tups than we do in sheep as a whole. Just things to think about: copper poisoning. So this picture top right, you can see the very yellow colour of the tissues. Copper poisoning's more common in tups just because of the concentrate feeding that they get. Any sheep are at risk of it if they get access to cattle feed. They're really sensitive to copper, but tups in particular with the high levels of concentrate feeding. So just be thoughtful about that, and extremely careful with supplementation. I wouldn't recommend supplementing them unless you'd had, you know, a consultation with your vet and it had been confirmed that there was a deficiency. Urinary obstruction, so you'll hear that Raymond mentioned in that video looking for any lumps that might indicate a urinary obstruction in the wee wormy process at the tip of the penis. You can see in this picture in the middle, hopefully, these kind of green stones within the kidney. This is a kidney that's just split in half. And these stones, these are sort of crystals, uroliths we call them, which have formed in the urine. And again, this is much more common in tups that are kind of encouraged on and forced on. If they are affected by urinary obstruction, they're really, really painful. So you can see from the way they stand, got a really sore belly. They'll often have a slightly arched back, quite a wide base stance. They really look miserable. And eventually you'll get a swelling of the penis, swelling of the undercarriage. They might be dribbling a tiny bit of urine occasionally, but it's not a proper flow. This is an absolute emergency. You need to see your vet immediately. So get in touch with them if you've got any suspicion of this. Excuse me. And finally, acidosis. So this is a picture of a rumen that's been opened up. You can see there's rather a lot of grain in that rumen. But tups would be more at risk of this, particularly if last minute panic, tups are looking on the lean side. Try and get condition onto them before they go out with the ewes. Be really, really careful. They don't need nearly as much grain as this in their rumen to develop acidosis and become very, very unwell. When we're post-morteming tups that have had acidosis, it amazes me how little grain actually is in the rumen. But when we check the acid levels, it's very, very acidic in there. So it's really important to have a think about. I think about the concentrate feeding and be very careful and gradual if you are trying to get condition onto them. Okay, just a very quick touch on ewe MOTs. I'm not going to go into detail with this because this is something you will mostly hopefully be familiar with, but very similar: teeth, teats, toes and trim. So check their teeth. If you are finding they're broken mouthed, they're not going to make great breeding stock. Obviously, they're not going to be able to nourish themselves with grazing. But if you're noticing you're pulling out a lot of ewes because they're quite thin, you know, unless teeth are an obvious explanation, because they've got none, I would investigate that. So don't just assume the loss of a tooth or two is all that there is to it. I think too many people probably just dispatch with thin ewes, saying, "Oh, that's it, they're thin, they're done." But actually, investigating thin ewes in terms of perhaps even sacrificing 2 to 4 for a post-mortem investigation with your vet is a really, really useful way of identifying some of these sort of what we call subclinical disease problems. They're not obviously an issue. You know, they don't wander around saying I'm diseased. Written across their forehead, but nonetheless they're thin, they're not as productive as they should be. You're ending up with a high culling rate, and if you can identify if there's a disease process underlying that, thinking along the lines of mydevisna, OPA, Johne's disease, these are all things that are worth trying to get to the bottom of. So, and again, just as we've said with tups, address any issues early. So if you examine them, look at their teeth, check their udders carefully, look out for any signs of previous mastitis. That means they're not going to be good milkers. Address lameness ASAP is an absolute priority, and making sure your body condition's right. If you do that early enough, you've got time to get them in really good strip before they go to the tup for maximum productivity. Okay, so wrapping up now, just a few take-home points. Plan ahead, plan ahead, plan ahead. That's been the theme with everything. Do things in advance. Think before the time comes to plan how you're going to manage your quarantine. If you can speak to your vet about getting a tailored plan into place so that you know exactly what treatments you're going to give, where they're going to be isolated, that takes a lot of the stress out of it. And just making sure you check your breeding stock early enough so that you've got time to act. So for a lot of folk now, time's getting tight. It's never too late, but resolve to go a bit earlier next year if you do run short of time this year. So I'll go back to Laura now, and we'll see if anybody's come in with any questions that we can answer in the next few minutes before we wrap up.
Right, so thank you for that presentation, Ellie. That's been very interesting. So, Ellie, we have got a question here. So, in your presentation, you mentioned the dreams versus reality. So, when it comes to quarantine practicalities, what would you recommend? So, when you're looking at the distance from other stock, whether it should be indoors and outdoors, and any essential treatments?
Okay, so in terms of distance, it's often quoted, but I think the best we have to go for is a minimum of 2 metre standoff. So we absolutely don't want nose-to-nose contact. That's really important. So you don't want them in a field that's right next door, divided only by a fence with other stock, essentially. In terms of indoor or outdoor, probably more important than that is actually having them on a surface that you can clean. So in an ideal world, what we'd want to do is yard them for sort of 48 hours or so after they arrive, and we treat them with a wormer, and that just allows them to pass out any of the worm eggs until the wormer actually gets to work, if you like, just gets the worst of the infection onto a concrete yard or something that you can then sort of wash away and sweep away, and it's not then contaminating the pasture with the worms from the dung. For most people, that's not an option, particularly if it's a larger number of animals and you've got to feed them and all the rest of it. It's not always that simple. And I think the next best thing is probably putting them straight onto really quite dirty pasture. Now, a lot of people struggle to get their heads around why we would do that. But contaminated pasture that's had your own sheep on it is full of their own parasites, and if the ones that are coming in have got resistance to some of the treatments you might use, at least there's a dilution effect with the resistant worms are then diluted. They're in amongst a population of worms that treatment is effective against, and so in terms of what develops and reinfects the next crop of sheep that go on there, it won't only be resistant ones that are getting grazed. It will be a mixture of resistant and susceptible worms. So that's probably the next best thing. The main thing I would say is if you can at all avoid it, don't put them onto ground where there's bog at all. Try and avoid putting them somewhere where there's any sort of fluke habitat, because that means that if they do shed fluke eggs in their dung, it can't then get into the snails and become a problem for your flock the next year, so or even later on that year. Was there another part to that question, Laura, that I've forgotten?
Essential treatments.
Essential treatments. Well, as I said, I don't think there's such a thing as no scab risk or low scab risk. So I think that addressing scab, I would say, is pretty much essential. In terms of other treatments, the precise treatment you use, you should probably discuss with your vet, because it will depend a little bit on what your capacity to quarantine them is in terms of which fluke treatments you would use in particular. So the specific treatments you use, you may well have something on your shelf anyway that you can use, and that's always the temptation. You've got it in the cupboard, so you want to turn to use that one because it's convenient and it's open anyway. But this is one of these scenarios where that could cost you dearly. So I think it's definitely worth having that discussion with your vet about, look, for me, what treatments should I be using to minimise the risk to me in my flock?
Right, and then someone has asked, when you were discussing earlier about checking the health status of your existing flock and the new flock, how many would you test, or should you test the whole flock?
Okay, it probably depends what you're looking for. I would start off with a chat with your vet about this. If you don't know anything about the disease status of your flock, which is unlikely, but might happen, then you might decide to focus on a couple of particular conditions and make sure you haven't got them in year one, for example. It depends if you're starting out a new flock, for example. But the likelihood is, in a flock that's been established for any period of time, your vet might well, through previous testing or just from knowing the flock, might well have suspicions that there might be issues with one problem or another, and that might steer you towards looking for specific things. In most cases, it's probably not practical to just test for every disease we can think of, unless you're aiming to set up a super high health pedigree flock, for example. But it doesn't mean it's not important. So I would start with talking to your vet. They'll potentially have quite a good idea of what you might need to be thinking about in terms of priorities, even if the history of your flock suggests that there might be certain conditions underway. For example, you may never have diagnosed Yonis in sheep, but if they share the ground with cattle and you've diagnosed Yonis in the cattle, that might be something to start with thinking of. In terms of how many you test, again, it depends very much what you're looking for. For some diseases, you would need to test the whole flock if you decided you wanted to be clear of something or eradicate something. If you just want to know whether you might have a condition within the flock, then sometimes you can test a smaller number as a sort of dipstick test to find out whether the problem's likely to be there or not. So MIDI Visna, for example, is an example where we might go and test 12 thin animals to try and determine whether we think that might be on the go. For Yonis disease, 12 animals wouldn't be enough. We would really probably be looking at, potentially casting the net a bit wider. So depends on the condition.
Okay, so just keep putting in your questions, and we'll have time for a couple more. But you mentioned earlier, Ailey, the various things that we should be looking at in the tup MOT. What if the tup fails on one element? Is that the end of the line for him, or is there another chance?
Okay, it probably depends largely on what he's failed on, but there is an argument that every element is as important as the next, because you could have a tup it's perfectly intact, very fertile, great body condition, everything's good, but if he's crippled because he's got a really painful foot, he's not going to be mounting ewes. He's just not. He's going to be lying down far more than he should. He'll be less fit. So there is an argument that one aspect of, it's like a table with four legs. If you're missing one leg, it's not going to work as a table. And it's a little bit like that with tups. So having said that, particularly if you find problems nice and early, it may well be that there's plenty of time to rectify them and it's not actually a big deal. So I think it depends very much on what you find, what the problem is, but get in there early and again, pick up the phone, give your vet a quick ring. They may be able to put your mind at rest or help you tackle it in the way that gets you back on track as much as possible.
Yep, and so with COVID-19 affecting our daily lives in particular, it's affected a lot of the upcoming sheep sales, and many of them are now being conducted online. How does that affect your ability to ask the buyer questions?
Okay, so if you're a really skeptical person, you could say, well, unless you really know the buyer personally, you're just asking them a question. How do you know what the answer is really? But I'm not that skeptical. I think on the whole, buyers are quite honest. I think, yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think there is that little bit of, we're a bit far removed now from other human beings, aren't we, in all sorts of respects. And I think this is one where I wouldn't say you can't replace that face-to-face conversation, but I think it is something probably that needs to be considered when we're looking at online sales. I know that obviously some bigger enterprises have sort of run their own private online sales, and that's great. And you can obviously approach them directly and ask those questions. You can, if they're advertising on Facebook, send them a message, ask them a question. A little bit different through Marts, but I think Do you know what I would say is ask the marts the question, because if there's pressure from the market to have information, then you asking that question will drive changes. So I think it's don't ever be shy to ask questions. It's a long time solving a problem once it's been brought in. So I think ask for information whenever the opportunity arises. But yeah, it is difficult. It is difficult. You're doing things remotely. And I think caution's important. I think if there's anything in particular anybody thinks of afterwards, or they want more detail on, they're very welcome to drop you a line. You can always pass it on to me, Laura. So happy to take questions at a later date if somebody comes offline and thinks, damn, I wish I'd asked this.